Fort Bragg, October 1997. 12 operators from the Naval Special Warfare Development Group have their thumbs on the detonator. C4 is fixed to the door, and 6 hours of planning has gone into every single movement. 3, 2. They are ready to blow the entry. What they do not know is that the mission is already over. Inside the building, 4 men from the Special Air Service are standing in the objective room, completely silent and completely unseen. They have been there for about 10 minutes. The hostages are already secure, the exercise is already finished, and the Americans have not even made it through the front door yet. This is the story of how that happened. About 24 hours earlier, Fort Bragg had laid on a joint training exercise between the Special Air Service and the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, also known as SEAL Team 6. They were staging a hostage rescue scenario. One building, multiple rooms, several role players acting as hostages and hostile forces inside. 2 units were given the same brief, the same objective, and even the same time window. The Naval Special Warfare Development Group on one side, and 22 Special Air Service on the other side. The rules were very simple. Get the hostages out alive, and how you do it is up to you. The Americans arrived with cases, equipment containers stacked on dollies, wheeled into the staging area like a small logistics operation. Breaching charges, flashbang grenades, communications rigs, night vision, cutting tools, and enough C4 to open every door in the building twice. They set up in a large planning room with maps already pinned to the walls and started organizing immediately. Roles were assigned and breach points were identified. A scale model of the target building was assembled on a table within the first hour. The Special Air Service showed up with almost nothing. A few men carrying Bergens. There were no crates, no planning boards, and no visible communications equipment beyond personal radios. One of them asked the exercise controllers a single question, a very simple question. The lads asked, "Where is the building?" Then they disappeared, without a notice. The Americans assumed they were setting up their own planning room somewhere else on the base. They were not. They were already working. The planning session ran for about 6 hours. The development group team went through every possible angle of approach, every contingency, and every abort scenario they could think of. They mapped the building floor by floor using photographs and blueprints that the exercise controllers had provided. 4 breach points were selected, with the primary entry being the front door, which would be blown inward with a shaped charge. 2 secondary entries would come through the ground floor windows, and a 4th team would go in from the roof if things went sideways. Every operator knew exactly where he would be standing at every second of the assault, and the timing was synchronized down to fractions of a second. Flashbang grenades would go through the windows at the exact moment the door charge went off, and the whole thing would take less than 90 seconds from the first explosion to full building clearance. It was a textbook plan, and it was thorough down to the last detail, which is exactly what the Special Air Service expected them to come up with. While the Americans were busy in their planning room, 2 men from the Special Air Service squadron took a walk past the target building in the late afternoon. They were not wearing any tactical gear, just plain clothes, and they looked like base personnel cutting through a car park on their way somewhere else. Nobody paid any attention to them because nobody had any reason to. They walked slowly, and they counted windows, and they looked at the locks on the doors. One of them crouched down to tie his shoe near the east side fire exit and spent about 30 seconds studying the door frame and the hinges while he was down there. Then they got up and left. The whole thing took about 15 minutes, and anyone watching would have just thought they were 2 blokes walking past a building on their way to the cookhouse. That night, the Americans went over their plan one more time, confirmed all the timings, checked their equipment, and went to sleep satisfied with the work they had done. They were confident, and they had every reason to be, because their plan was solid and their team was one of the best in the world at this sort of thing. Around 2 in the morning, 2 Special Air Service operators left their accommodation block and walked back to the target building. no torches, and no noise. Just two men moving through the dark the way they had been trained to move through the dark in South Armagh and the Bogside, where being seen meant being shot, and being heard meant being dead. They had changed into dark clothing and soft-soled shoes. One of them was carrying a small pouch with a pick set and a tension wrench, and the other one carried nothing at all. They reached the east side fire exit, and one of them started working on the lock, while the other stood with his back to the wall watching the approach. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes, and the door opened without making a sound. Before going in, one of them placed a thin strip of tape across the door frame at ankle height. If anyone else opened that door while they were inside, the tape would break, and they would know they had been compromised on the way out. It was a trick they had picked up in Belfast. Small things like that kept you alive. They went inside slowly, moving room by room, not clearing it the way you would in an assault, but reading it the way you would read a book. Where are the walls? And where are the corners? And where does the floor creak? And where are the role players sleeping? And where are the hostages being held? They tested each step before putting their weight down, rolling from heel to toe the way the regiment had taught its operators to move through occupied houses in Northern Ireland. A creaking floorboard in a terraced house in West Belfast at 3 in the morning could get you killed, and the same discipline applied here, even though nobody was actually going to shoot them. The habit was just too deeply trained to switch off. They mapped the entire interior of the building in their heads without writing a single thing down. One of them found the objective room on the second floor, and he stood in the doorway for about 45 seconds, counting bodies and noting positions and working out lines of sight and mentally marking where each hostage was sitting relative to the door. Then, they left the same way they came in. The tape on the door frame was still intact, which meant nobody had followed them. They closed the door behind them and walked back to their accommodation block through the dark. The Americans had spent 6 hours building a plan from photographs and blueprints. The Special Air Service had spent 40 minutes inside the actual building while everyone else was asleep. They did not need a scale model because they had walked through the real thing with their own feet. They did not need to plan 4 breach points because they already had a door that opened quietly and a route that avoided every creaking floorboard in the building. Northern Ireland had taught them all of this. 14 years of operating in Belfast and Derry, where every door you kicked was a door that might have a family behind it or a camera crew filming from across the street. You could not blow your way into a house on the Falls Road without the whole neighborhood knowing about it within minutes, and the consequences of that kind of noise were severe. So the regiment learned to be invisible. They learned how to enter buildings without leaving any trace, how to move through occupied spaces without being detected, and how to leave no sign that they were ever there. It was not flashy, and it was not dramatic, but it worked in places where drama got people killed. The Americans had learned their trade in a completely different school. After the Desert One disaster in 1980, where the attempt to rescue hostages from the American embassy in Tehran fell apart in the Iranian desert, the United States military rebuilt its entire special operations capability from the ground up. The lesson they took from that failure was that speed and overwhelming force were everything. Train harder and move faster, and hit the target with so much violence that the enemy never has time to react. It produced some of the finest direct action soldiers anywhere in the world, but it also produced a doctrine that assumed every problem was a door that needed to be blown open. At about 5:45 in the morning, the development group operators kitted up in silence. Weapons were checked, charges were confirmed, and communications were tested. They moved to their staging positions around the building in the grey light before dawn and stacked up at the 4 breach points. The team leader ran through his final confirmations on the radio, and every man was in position and every charge was live. The countdown began. At 5 minutes to 6, the Special Air Service team left their accommodation. Just 4 men. They walked to the east side of the building without rushing, and one of them opened the fire exit the same way he had opened it about 6 hours earlier. They went inside, moved through the ground floor corridor, up the stairwell, and into the second-floor objective room in under 3 minutes. The role players who were acting as hostages looked up when they came in, and one of them started to say something, but the lead operator just put a finger to his lips. Then the 4 of them sat down and waited. At 6 on the dot, the development group team leader gave the order. 3, 2, 1. The radio crackled. Exercise control came on and announced that the hostages had been recovered, the building was secure, and the exercise was over. The Americans just stared at each other. Nobody had pressed the detonator, and nobody had thrown a flashbang, and nobody had fired a single round. The building they had spent 6 hours planning to enter had already been cleared by 4 men who walked in through a side door without making a sound. There was a long pause on the radio, and then somebody asked who actually had the hostages. The debrief was held about 2 hours later in a conference room on the main base. Both teams attended, and the exercise controllers sat at the front. The development group team was quiet, and it was the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with professionalism and everything to do with the fact that they had just been outmaneuvered by a team half their size, carrying a quarter of their equipment. The Special Air Service sergeant who had led the operation was asked to explain how his team had completed the objective. He stood up and spoke for about 5 minutes, with no slides and no diagrams and no self-congratulation of any kind. He went through the afternoon walk past the building and the lock on the east fire exit and the night entry and the layout of the interior. He described the route they took to the second-floor objective room and the creaking floorboard on the landing that they stepped over and the window on the stairwell that they kept below because a streetlight outside would have thrown their silhouette onto the far wall. He spoke the way you would expect a Special Air Service sergeant to speak, flat and factual, like he was reading off a shopping list. There was no swagger in it at all. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was just explaining what they did and why they did it in the most straightforward way possible. One of the American operators asked him when his team had actually started planning the assault. The sergeant said they had not planned an assault at all. They had planned an entry. 2 completely different things. An assault assumes resistance, and an entry assumes intelligence. If you know enough about a building, you do not need to fight your way in. You just need a door. Another American asked why they had not used any explosives. The sergeant said that explosives tell everyone in the building exactly where you are and exactly when you are coming. A lockpick does not tell anyone anything at all. In Belfast, he said, they once spent 3 consecutive nights entering and leaving the same house to plant a listening device, and the family living there never even knew they had been inside. You simply cannot do that with C4, he said. The regiment had a saying about doors. A door is only a problem if you need to go through it quickly. If you have time, a door is just a door. A third operator asked about the tape on the fire exit. The sergeant explained it without making any fuss about it. Standard operating procedure from Northern Ireland. You leave markers on your entry point so you know if anyone has followed you in or if the building has been disturbed while you are inside. It costs nothing, and it takes about 2 seconds. And it tells you whether you are walking into a clean exit or an ambush. In a training exercise, it does not matter all that much. But the regiment trains the way it fights, and in Belfast or Basra, the difference between a clean exit and a compromised one was the difference between going home and not going home. The room went quiet after that, not because it was some kind of dramatic moment, but because every single operator in that room understood what it meant. The Americans had been trained to overwhelm a problem, and the Special Air Service had been trained to dissolve it. Both approaches worked, but one of them required 6 hours of planning and 12 men and enough explosive ordnance to level a small building. The other required 2 men and a lockpick and the patience to spend 40 minutes walking through a dark building in socks. The development group team leader said something generous after the debrief. He told the room that his team had learned more in 24 hours than they had in the previous 6 months of internal training, and he meant it. These were not men with fragile egos. They were professionals who understood that someone had just shown them something they did not know, and the correct response to that was to shut up and take notes. After the debrief, the two teams went their separate ways. The development group flew back to Virginia Beach, and the Special Air Service went back to Hereford. The exercise was filed, and reports were written. Lessons learned were documented in the way that military bureaucracies always document lessons learned, which is to say they were typed up and mostly forgotten by anyone who was not actually in the room when it happened. But one operator from the development group did not forget. He sat alone in the team room that evening after everyone else had gone for the night, with a notebook open in front of him, trying to write down what he had seen. Not the tactical details, because he had those already. He had memorized the route the Special Air Service took into the building, the lock technique, the method of moving through occupied space without detection. All of that was straightforward enough. You could teach it, and you could train it, and you could add it to the program and run it, until every operator on the team could pick a lock in the dark blindfolded. What he could not write down was the thing underneath all of it, the instinct, the willingness to spend a night walking through a building in socks instead of spending 6 hours planning to blow it open. The discipline to sit in a dark room for 10 minutes, waiting for the right moment to move instead of creating your own moment with a shaped charge. The comfort with silence, and the comfort with patience, and the willingness to look like you were doing absolutely nothing while actually doing everything. He had been trained to believe that speed was the answer to every tactical problem, and for most tactical problems, speed was the answer. But the Special Air Service had shown him a scenario where speed was not just unnecessary, but was actively working against you. All that planning and all that coordination and all that explosive ordnance, and 4 men with a lockpick had walked past all of it like it was not even there. He wrote one line in his notebook before closing it for the night, and he never shared it with anyone. But the story made its way through the special operations community anyway, the way these stories always do when the people involved are not allowed to talk about what they do for a living. It got retold in team rooms and briefing halls and bars near Fort Bragg and Coronado and Dam Neck for years afterwards. The details shifted depending on who was telling it. Sometimes it was Delta Force instead of the development group, and sometimes the Special Air Service used the back door instead of the fire exit. Sometimes they picked the lock, and sometimes they had already made a copy of the key days before the exercise even started. The version does not really matter. The point was always the same. The Americans had perfected the art of kicking the door down. The Special Air Service had perfected the art of making sure the door was already open before anyone even knew they were there. About 20 years later, a retired operator from the development group was asked during an interview about the most important lesson he ever learned during joint training. He did not mention any of the big exercises, or the live fire packages, or the maritime interdiction serials, or the high-altitude jumps. He mentioned Fort Bragg, and he mentioned a fire exit. And he said the thing that stayed with him all those years was not what the Special Air Service did, but how little they actually needed to do it. When you have watched a man walk through a locked building in the middle of the night, carrying nothing but a set of picks and a pair of socks, and come out the other side holding the objective before anyone even knew he was gone, it changes the way you think about everything. About planning, and about equipment, and about what it actually means to be good at this job. He said the Special Air Service taught him something that no amount of training could ever replicate, that the loudest thing in the room is almost never the most dangerous, and that the best operators he ever worked with were the ones who left no trace, made no noise, and needed nothing but time.